A grizzly bear can kill in seconds. Weighing up to half a ton and running faster than a racehorse, it's a predator built for dominance. Attacks are rare but often brutal, usually triggered by surprise encounters, food competition, or protecting cubs. Hikers and campers in bear country must stay alert, carry bear spray, and know how to react if charged. As human activity pushes further into wild habitats, conflicts increase. Understanding grizzlies isn't just about survival. It's about coexisting with one of nature's most powerful creatures. In late October 2021, Jack Callahan moved with purpose through the golden aspens deep in the rugged backcountry of the northwest corner of Wyoming. A seasoned hunter, he had spent the past 3 days tracking a large bull elk during the peak of the rut. The crisp mountain air carried the pungent scent of pine, and the distant bugle of another bull echoed through the valley. Jack had been bow hunting for years and knew this was prime time. Bulls were aggressive and responding to calls. He was patient, precise, and prepared for almost anything. Almost. His Hoyt Carbon RX-4 rested against a nearby tree, its limbs vibrating slightly from the shot he had just taken. The bull lay 30 yards away, its massive frame collapsed amid fallen leaves. Jack exhaled, satisfaction washing over him. He reached for his field dressing kit, ready to begin the tedious work of breaking down the elk before the sun dipped below the horizon. Then he heard it. A deep, guttural exhalation. Heavy breathing, unmistakable and far too close. His muscles tensed as he turned, instinctively reaching for the canister of bear spray on his chest. Just beyond the tree line, no more than 50 feet away, a grizzly stood, its massive shoulders rolling forward as it took deliberate steps toward him. The bear's fur was dark, thick, and matted from the last traces of summer fat. Its nose flared, nostrils pulling in the fresh scent of blood and meat. Jack had encountered grizzlies before, but this one was different. It wasn't hesitating, it wasn't assessing, it had already been decided. Jack raised the bear spray and depressed the trigger, sending a thick orange mist between them. The wind was in his favor. He knew the chemical should engulf the bear's face, triggering its sensitive sinuses and driving it away. But it didn't. The grizzly charged straight through the cloud as if it were nothing more than morning fog. Jack barely had time to react before his hand went to his hip, fingers wrapping around the grip of his .44 Magnum. He fired once, the shot slamming into the bear's shoulder. It stumbled but did not stop. A second shot hit the chest, and the third, one he barely had time to aim, struck near its neck. Still, it kept coming. Jack had no choice. He sprinted for the nearest tree, an old pine with just enough low branches to give him a chance. His boots dug into the soft earth as he scrambled up, gripping the rough bark with desperate hands. He was barely out of reach when the bear swiped at his leg, claws raking through the air where his foot had been a second earlier. Jack could see the grizzly below from his perch, blood seeping into its thick fur. It was hurt but still full of rage. It pawed at the ground, snapping its jaws, sending waves of hot breath into the cold air. The minutes dragged on like hours, the bear circling the tree, occasionally lunging at the trunk, its powerful frame shaking the branches. Jack's fingers ached from gripping the branch too tightly. His chest burned with each breath, his pulse thundering in his ears. The bear wouldn't leave. It didn't care about the wounds. It wanted him. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear slowed. Its legs wobbled. It let out a low, guttural growl before collapsing onto its side, the adrenaline finally wearing off as blood loss took its toll. Even then, Jack didn't move. He watched, waited, breathing as quietly as possible. When the bear's breathing finally stopped, he let out a slow, shaking exhale. Climbing down, he cautiously approached the massive animal, revolver still in hand. The bear was dead. Jack stood over it, exhaustion settling into his bones. He had read about bear spray failures before, but experiencing one firsthand was entirely different. He looked back at his elk, partially torn apart from the scuffle. The night was approaching fast. He had no choice but to leave most of the meat behind. By the time he made it back to camp, his hands were still trembling. He knew he had been seconds from death, saved only by his firearm and a sturdy pine tree. It was a lesson he wouldn't forget. In grizzly country, bear spray wasn't always enough. The walk back to camp was long and filled with an eerie silence. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by an unsettling realization. He had nearly died. The solitude of the wilderness, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Every sound, from the rustling of wind through the trees to the distant howls of coyotes, seemed amplified, as if the forest reminded him of how close he had come to never leaving it. He couldn't shake the feeling that something else was watching him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. Jack forced himself to keep moving. His body ached, his fingers were raw from gripping the tree for so long, and exhaustion gnawed at the corners of his mind. He had spent years in the wild and had seen his fair share of close calls, but this was different. The thought of returning to retrieve what remained of his elk sent a shudder through him. Would another predator have already claimed it? Would he find himself staring down another bear? The wilderness didn't care about his fears. It only respected survival. When he finally stumbled into camp, he felt the weight of his rifle settle heavily across his lap as he collapsed onto a log by the fire. He stared into the flames, trying to push away the images of the attack. He forced himself to eat and drink, but his hands still shook with residual fear. He had always considered himself prepared, but had learned a valuable lesson. The wild could not be tamed, only respected. The next morning, he made the decision. He wouldn't go back for the elk. Losing the meat was a bitter pill, but he had no doubt the carcass had already drawn scavengers. He packed up his gear, ensuring every strap and buckle was secure before making the long trek back to his truck. He could still feel the bear's presence lingering in his mind with every step. It was a story he would carry with him for the rest of his days, a reminder of the thin line between hunter and hunted. In early September 1997, deep in the Caribou region of British Columbia, Russell Hargrove and Dave Larkin set out on their annual moose hunt. The region's dense forests were known for their thick undergrowth and sprawling valleys, creating ideal conditions for big game. With the rut in full swing, bulls were calling out across the landscape, their haunting bellows echoing through the trees. The two hunters had spent years perfecting their methods, using cow calls and patience to lure in massive bulls. The morning had started well. They had scouted fresh tracks along the creek bed and found rubs where bulls had shredded tree bark. The sign was promising. They decided to split up. Russell would follow a set of prints leading deeper into the woods, while Dave hiked up a nearby ridge to glass the area. Russell moved carefully, his .338 Winchester Magnum held at the ready, stepping lightly to avoid making unnecessary noise. The air was still, and the silence made a hunter feel alone in the vast wilderness. Yet, as he pressed forward, that feeling shifted. A creeping unease settled into his gut, an instinct honed from years in the wild. It wasn't a sound nor a distinct sight, just something off. He paused, scanning the thick brush, his breath slow and controlled. Then, a twig snapped. His heart pounded. He turned slowly, expecting to see a bear or a lurking wolf. But what he saw was neither. A man stood about 50 yards away, partially obscured by the trees. His clothes were filthy, hanging in tattered layers, his long, matted hair draped over his shoulders. He grinned, an unsettling, wide-mouthed expression that sent a chill down Russell's spine. He held a rusty machete in his right hand, its blade dulled and pockmarked with corrosion. The man didn't move or speak. He only stared, his smile frozen in place. Russell's grip on his rifle tightened. He had encountered plenty of odd people in the backcountry, hermits, survivalists, drifters, but this was different. The man's posture, the gleam in his eye, and the way he lingered just within sight weren't right. Russell took a slow step backward, keeping the barrel of his rifle slightly raised but not pointed directly at the stranger. The man took a step forward. Russell didn't wait. He shifted his stance and fired a warning shot into the air, the blast shattering the eerie silence. The man flinched, his grin faltering for the briefest moment before he turned and sprinted into the trees, vanishing as swiftly as he had appeared. Russell stood frozen for a moment, pulse hammering in his ears. He quickly backed away, retracing his steps, his head swaying. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move. Every rustling leaf sent a fresh wave of unease through him. When he reached the meeting point with Dave, his nerves were shot. Dave raised an eyebrow at Russell's pale face and the tension in his shoulders. After explaining what had happened, they made a hasty decision. Hunt or not, they weren't spending another night in those woods. As they hiked back toward their truck, they noticed something more unsettling. Trees along the trail had been marked, deep carvings etched into the bark, strange symbols that neither recognized. Some looked like crude faces, others like twisted, angular patterns. The markings hadn't been there the day before. Russell never returned to that part of the Caribou region. He heard rumors over the years, stories of strange sightings, missing hikers, and unexplained remains found deep in the forest. Some said a hermit had lived in those woods for decades, shunning society, surviving off whatever he could hunt or steal. Others whispered about something darker, something worse. Russell never cared to find out. One thing was certain. He had gone looking for a moose, but something else had been hunting him. Neither spoke much that night as they drove away, the weight of the encounter settling heavily in the truck's cab. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the endless stretch of dirt road ahead. But both men kept glancing at the rearview mirrors as if expecting someone to be following them. Every time Russell blinked, he saw that face again, that grin. The man had been playing a game with him, and he was sure of that, and Russell had no interest in playing. Days later, after returning home, Russell couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. He woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced he had heard footsteps outside his window. He double-checked the locks on his doors, something he had never done before. The woods had always been his escape, his sanctuary. Now they felt different, violated. Months later, a ranger friend mentioned an incident near the same area. A group of hikers had stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. Scattered around were crude wooden carvings resembling the same symbols Russell had seen on the trees. No one ever determined who had lived there, but the rangers quietly suggested people avoid that stretch of forest altogether. Too many strange occurrences, too many disappearances. Russell had hunted in some of the most remote places in North America, faced down bears, wolves, and raging storms. But nothing had unsettled him quite like that encounter. He never spoke much about it, only mentioning it vaguely to those who asked why he refused to return to the Caribou region. He had learned something that day. Not everything in the wild was an animal, and nothing human could be trusted. High in the San Juan Mountains region, southwest Colorado, in the crisp dawn of September 2014, Ethan Grady moved carefully through the dense timberline. The mountain air was thin but invigorating, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was prime elk season, and he had been tracking a bugling bull for hours. With his Matthews Creed XS bow, he stepped lightly, every movement controlled and deliberate. This was his third year bow hunting in these mountains, And he had come to appreciate the challenge of closing the distance without being detected. The bull was close. Ethan could hear its heavy breaths as it raked a nearby tree with its antlers, asserting dominance. He nocked an arrow, steadying his breath. One well-placed shot was all he needed. But as he prepared to draw, a sound from behind made his blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, so close it sent vibrations through his chest. Slowly, he turned his head. Less than 20 feet away, a mountain lion stood, its tawny coat blending almost perfectly with the undergrowth. Its ears were pinned back, tail flicking rhythmically. Ethan knew enough about mountain lions to understand what that meant. This wasn't curiosity, it was hunting him. Ethan resisted every instinct telling him to run. Running would make him prey. Instead, he straightened, spreading his arms wide, making himself appear as large as possible. He let out a sharp, commanding yell, hoping to startle the cat into retreat. It didn't move. Its muscles coiled tighter, its gaze locked onto his every motion. The predator began to circle, stepping lightly over twigs and moss-covered stones. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized it likely stalked him for a while. He needed to act fast. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, he reached for his Glock 20 10mm, holstered on his belt. His fingers wrapped around the grip just as the cougar tensed, its haunches shifting. Then it lunged. Ethan barely had time to bring the pistol up before the cat closed the distance. He squeezed the trigger as the cougar's muscular frame exploded toward him. The first shot struck its shoulder, slowing but not stopping it. The force of impact sent Ethan stumbling backward. The cat hit the ground, snarling but still advanced, claws tearing into the dirt. He fired again, this time aiming for center mass. The second shot hit true, dropping the cougar just feet from him. Ethan's chest heaved as he stood there, gun still raised, waiting for movement. After a few tense seconds, the cat finally lay still. His hands trembled as the reality of what had just happened settled in. He had faced predators before, bears rummaging through camp, coyotes trailing too close, but never had he been the one hunted so deliberately. Regaining his composure, he holstered the pistol and looked around. The bull he had been tracking was long gone. He hadn't even heard it run off. His focus had been too locked on survival. He exhaled sharply, the rush of adrenaline leaving him exhausted. After taking a few pictures for documentation, he started the hike back to camp. With every step, his senses remained heightened, ears tuned to the slightest rustle. The realization gnawed at him. If he hadn't turned at just the right moment, he might not have walked out of those woods. He had always known mountain lions were solitary, elusive creatures. But now he understood something deeper. Sometimes you aren't just passing through their territory, you are the prey. Ethan never hunted alone again after that trip. Even with years of experience and the best gear, the encounter had shifted something in him. The mountains had always been a place of freedom, challenge, and adventure. But that day they had reminded him of an unspoken rule. Out here, humans weren't at the top of the food chain. That night, back at camp, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. Every sound outside the thin fabric of his tent sent his heart racing. The wind rustled through the pines, an owl called in the distance, but all he could think about was the silent approach of padded feet. He replayed the attack in his mind, wondering just how long the cougar had been stalking him before it decided to strike. Had I been watching him since sunrise? Since the moment he had stepped into the woods? The next morning, he packed up camp earlier than planned. The excitement of the hunt had been drained from him, replaced by an unease that clung to his thoughts like a shadow. As he hiked back to his truck, he noticed something unsettling. Tracks, fresh cougar prints following the same trail he had taken the night before. They weren't just from the cat he had shot. There had been another. Ethan shivered despite the warmth of the rising sun. He had killed one predator, but another had been lurking, watching. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He had always considered himself an apex predator in these mountains, but now he knew better. He wasn't alone out here, and he never truly had been. Ethan continued to hunt in the following years, but never returned to that valley. He told the story to a few close friends, but most just laughed it off, saying he had probably spooked himself more than anything. But Ethan knew what he had seen, what he had felt, and now and then, when the wind howled through the trees just right, he swore he could hear it again, that low primal growl that had nearly been the last sound he ever heard. In the unforgiving Kuskokwim of western Alaska, November 1993, Bill Yates and his younger brother Tom trudged through the knee-deep snow searching for caribou. The vast expanse of white stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by distant clusters of black spruce and the occasional rocky outcrop. They had been hunting for 3 days, their supplies running thin, and the cold had begun to wear on them. The tundra was merciless this time of year, but they had always prided themselves on being able to handle whatever the wild threw their way. They had spotted a small herd that morning, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they moved along the frozen river. The brothers knew better than to delay. The game moved quickly, and the worsening weather meant this could be their last opportunity before they were forced to head back to camp. Bill crouched, raising his Remington 700, the barrel steady despite the numbing chill. He aimed at a large bull lagging behind the group. Just as he prepared to squeeze the trigger, a gust of wind howled through the valley, and with it came the first flakes of an oncoming storm. Within minutes, the sky darkened, and the wind became relentless, whipping ice crystals into their exposed faces. They hesitated only a moment before realizing the danger. The caribou had already vanished into the white abyss, and the landscape around them was becoming unrecognizable. Visibility dropped to near zero, turning the tundra into a swirling nightmare of snow and wind. GPS was useless in these conditions, and their compass needle spun erratically in the mounting storm. Bill shouted to Tom over the deafening wind, signaling to move toward what they hoped was the direction of camp. Each step was a battle, their boots sinking into unseen drifts, every breath burning in their lungs. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2. The terrain felt unfamiliar. Landmarks were buried beneath the accumulating snow, and disorientation set in. The real danger came when Bill felt his foot sink too deep. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the storm as the ice beneath him gave way. Before he could react, he was falling, plunging into freezing water. The current beneath the ice was sluggish but powerful enough to pull him under. He thrashed, trying to find something to grab onto. Cold knifed into his limbs, sapping his strength almost instantly. Tom reacted fast. He threw himself down, spreading his weight to avoid breaking through. With one gloved hand, he reached for Bill, while the other gripped his rifle sling, using it as a makeshift lifeline. Bill gasped, barely able to feel his fingers as he clawed at the ice's edge. Tom pulled with everything he had, his muscles burning as he freed his brother. They collapsed in the snow, Bill convulsing from the shock, his clothes stiffening into ice. Tom ripped off his coat, throwing it over Bill's shoulders. They had minutes, maybe less, before hypothermia took hold. Without shelter, they wouldn't last the night. They needed a windbreak to shield them from the full force of the blizzard. They carved into a deep snowbank using knives, hollowing out a makeshift shelter large enough to crawl inside. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing between them and the lethal cold. Tom stuffed their emergency blanket around Bill and pressed his body close to share warmth. Outside, the wind screamed, carrying the distant howls of wolves. They were vulnerable, but movement was impossible. The night stretched on, each hour a brutal test of endurance. Bill's shivering eventually slowed. a sign that scared Tom more than anything. He kept talking, keeping his brother awake, forcing him to drink small sips of water. If Bill lost consciousness, he might never wake up. By the time the first pale light of dawn seeped through the cracks of their shelter, the blizzard had finally passed. The world outside was transformed into a featureless wasteland of white dunes. Exhausted but determined, they forced themselves to their feet, their limbs sluggish from the cold. The hike back to camp was agonizing. Bill's soaked clothes had frozen stiff every step, like dragging weights through cement. But after hours of struggle, the familiar outline of their tent finally appeared in the distance. Relief flooded them as they collapsed inside, fumbling for their stove to warm their frozen bodies. Bill later admitted that night was the most terrifying experience of his life. He had always respected the wild, but that storm had shown him a different side of it, a raw, merciless force that cared nothing for human will or experience. They had survived, but barely. From that day on, he never took another hunting trip without being over-prepared for the cold. Some lessons were learned the easy way. Others, like this one, came with a price. Even after they had returned home, the experience lingered. Bill couldn't shake the memory of the silence that had fallen during the storm, the eerie, suffocating quiet that had settled when the wind momentarily died down, as if the world had been holding its breath. He dreamed of it often, waking in a cold sweat, his body remembering the bone-deep chill of the tundra. Weeks later, Tom researched accounts of other hunters lost in Alaskan blizzards. Some had never been found. Others were discovered too late, their bodies frozen solid, still clutching their rifles. The thought made his stomach twist. They had come so close to being just another tragic statistic. It wasn't their skill that had saved them, it was sheer luck, a break in the storm at just the right moment. One night, over whiskey and firelight, Bill and Tom sat together, reliving every brutal second of their ordeal. They both agreed that something had changed in them. There was no arrogance left, no illusion of control over nature. They had faced death in its rawest form, and though they had walked away, they would never look at the wilderness the same way again. Decades later, long after they had stopped hunting together, Bill still told the story to anyone who would listen. He never spoke of it as a boast or grand adventure, but as a warning. He would say that the cold didn't care about anyone, that it didn't care how tough a person thought they were, it just took. And every time he said it, his hands would tighten around his coffee cup, as if he could still feel the ice creeping into his bones. In the dense, untamed forests of Aroostook County, northern Maine, in October 2009, Logan Brooks trudged quietly through the underbrush, rifle in hand. The moose rut was in full swing, and he had been tracking a massive bull near the Allagash Wilderness Basin for over an hour. The crisp autumn air carried the pungent scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the distant calls of loons echoed across the vast expanse of untouched wilderness. Logan was an experienced hunter, and he knew that patience was key. He had spotted fresh rubs along the trees and deep hoof prints in the soft mud, signs that the bull was close. His .300 Winchester Magnum was chambered and ready, its powerful round more capable of bringing down even the largest moose. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he followed the tracks, careful not to break any twigs underfoot. Then he saw it. The bull was colossal, its massive rack of antlers spanning nearly 6 feet across. It stood in a clearing, its breath steaming in the cool air as it surveyed its surroundings. Logan slowly raised his rifle, taking careful aim just behind the shoulder. He had a clear shot and knew he had to make it count. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the forest, sending a flock of birds into the sky. The bull staggered, its muscles rippling as the bullet struck true, but instead of collapsing, it turned its head toward Logan, eyes burning with primal fury. Its nostrils flared, and then, without hesitation, it charged. Logan barely had time to react. He worked the bolt, trying to chamber another round, but the rifle jammed. His heart pounded as the moose barreled toward him, its hooves pounding the earth like a freight train. There was no time to reload, no time to run. He dove behind a thick pine tree with pure instinct as the bull crashed through the undergrowth. The sound of snapping branches and thundering hooves filled the air. Logan hit the ground hard, rolling onto his back as the enraged animal passed within inches of him, its antlers gouging deep grooves into the tree's bark. The bull stumbled, its strength finally giving out as it collapsed mere yards away, its massive body heaving with labored breaths. Logan lay there momentarily staring at the sky, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had never seen an animal take a shot like that and keep going. Shakily, he pushed himself to his feet, his hands still trembling as he chambered a fresh round. He approached the bull cautiously, rifle ready, but it was over. The adrenaline was slow to fade, and his body still felt electrified from the near-death encounter. That night, as he dressed the moose and prepared for the long haul back to camp, he replayed the moment repeatedly in his head. He had always respected the power of these animals, but this experience had seared a lesson into his mind. Sometimes even the best shot wasn't enough. Sometimes nature fought back with everything it had. As the night deepened and the cold settled in, Logan remained restless. The encounter played in his mind like a looping reel, each detail more vivid than the last. The look in the bull's eyes before it charged and the sheer power behind its movements were unlike anything he had ever witnessed. He had read stories about wounded animals turning aggressive, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. He had always considered moose majestic yet passive creatures, but now he knew better. In that moment, the bull hadn't been just an animal. It had been a force of nature. The next morning he set out early, the weight of his pack heavier than usual. He had to make multiple trips to haul the meat, which left his muscles aching. Each time he returned to the site, he couldn't help but glance at where the moose had fallen. The ground was torn apart, and the bark on nearby trees was scarred from the encounter. It was a silent reminder of how quickly things could have ended differently. Later that week, Logan stopped at a small general store nearby to restock supplies before heading home. The locals, seasoned hunters themselves, listened intently as he recounted the tale over coffee. One of the older men, a lifelong woodsman, simply nodded and said, "Sometimes they didn't know they're dead yet." The words stuck with Logan. The bull hadn't gone down easily. In those final moments, it had fought with everything it had left. For years after, Logan never hunted moose the same way again. He was still a hunter and respected the land, but something had shifted. Whenever he lined up a shot, he remembered that moment, the charge, the jammed rifle, the inches between him and disaster. It wasn't fear that stayed with him, but respect, a deep, profound understanding that in the wild nothing was guaranteed. Even with skill and the right equipment, survival could still come down to a matter of seconds. Long after the last cuts of meat had been wrapped and stored and the rack had been mounted in its place of honor above the fireplace, Logan still found his thoughts returning to that bull. It hadn't been just another hunt. It had tested his patience, nerve, and instincts like no other animal. Something in the way the bull had moved through the timber, silent and deliberate, made Logan question who was tracking whom. It was as if the forest held its breath, waiting to see who would falter first. When the moment came, it wasn't clean. It wasn't easy. It was drawn out, grueling. A battle of wills between two creatures forged by the wild. And though Logan had won in the end, the victory carried a weight that didn't lift with time. It lingered, like the fog that clung to the lowland trails at dawn. Even now, seasons later, when he returned to the woods and the wind whispered through the pines, or a loon's cry echoed across the glassy lake, that memory returned sharp and alive. He would pause, rifle slung over his shoulder, and feel it again, that fleeting electric moment when he and the bull were equals. Not predator and prey, but two beings locked in a quiet, ancient struggle. And for that breathless instant, neither was certain who would walk away. In the remote Missouri River breaks in central Montana, in the frigid December of 1956, veteran trapper Frank Delaney trudged through knee-deep snow, the weight of his Winchester Model 70 comforting in his grip. He had spent decades in these mountains, setting trap lines, living off the land, and understanding the silent, primal rhythm of the wild. The cold was biting, but he had long grown accustomed to it. The forest at this time of year was deathly quiet, save for the occasional creaking of snow-laden branches. The day had been productive, his traps yielding a decent haul of mink and fox pelts. As the last light of day bled into the distant peaks, he set up camp for the night rather than risk a treacherous trek back to his cabin in the dark. He found a clearing sheltered by a ring of tall pines, stomped down the snow, and built a small fire. The warmth seeped into his bones, and for a while, all was still. Then the feeling came. Frank had been in the wilderness long enough to recognize when something was watching him. It was an instinct as reliable as his rifle, honed from years of dealing with wolves, bears, and the occasional stranger wandering too far from civilization. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He only listened. The crack of a branch, the soft crunch of snow, deliberate and slow. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance beyond the glow of the fire. That's when he saw them, two glowing eyes reflecting the firelight from just beyond the tree line. Too high off the ground to be a wolf, too still to be a passing deer. His pulse quickened. A bear, maybe? But no, bears should have been deep in hibernation by now. And this thing wasn't moving like a bear. He let his hand drift toward his rifle, but didn't raise it, not yet. Instead, he slowly stoked the fire, making himself appear larger. Predators respected fire, at least most of them did. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The eyes never blinked, never wavered. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, swallowed by the dark, as if they had never been there. Frank remained on edge, scanning the woods, waiting for any movement. The fire crackled and the wind howled through the trees, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion crept in. He retreated to his bedroll but kept his rifle close. His ears were tuned to the silence beyond the firelight. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the feeling that something still lingered out there just beyond the reach of his senses. At dawn, he rose stiffly, his breath curling in the freezing air. Stepping beyond his camp, he searched for tracks, half hoping to confirm what he had seen the night before. What he found chilled him more than the morning cold. Massive prints circled his campsite. Too large for a wolf, too strange for a bear. Whatever had been watching him had walked the perimeter of his camp multiple times before vanishing into the forest. There was no sign of it dragging a tail, no familiar claw marks, just deep impressions in the snow, heavier than any animal he had ever encountered. Frank wasn't a man easily spooked, but he didn't linger. He packed his gear quickly, making sure to leave nothing behind. As he made his way back to his cabin, rifle in hand, he couldn't shake the unease settling in his gut. He never saw the eyes again, but he knew with absolute certainty that something had been there that night, something that had watched him, measured him, and for whatever reason, decided to let him be. As the years passed, Frank returned to that night more often than he cared to admit. It wasn't fear that stayed with him, but curiosity, an itch in the back of his mind that he could never quite scratch. He had seen nearly every predator Montana had to offer and studied their movements, habits, and tracks. But nothing matched what had circled his camp that night. He often wondered what would have happened if he had shot at it and challenged whatever had been standing in the dark. Would it have run? Or would it have answered back? One winter evening, well into his later years, Frank spoke with an old Blackfoot tracker he had befriended over the decades. The man listened intently as Frank recounted the details, his face betraying no emotion. When the story was finished, the old tracker simply nodded and said that not everything in those woods fears fire. Some things were watched because they could. The words unsettled Frank more than he cared to admit. On rare occasions, when the night stretched too long and the wind rattled his cabin walls, Frank swore he could still feel that presence just beyond the firelight. A shadow at the edge of his vision, a whisper of something just outside his reach. He never spoke about it to anyone else, never put a name to what he had seen. Some mysteries, he decided, were better left unsolved. Even in his final years, as his body grew frail and his trapping days ended, Frank would still sit by his fireplace and stare into the flames. And sometimes, in the silence of his own home, he would glance toward the window, half expecting to see those same unblinking eyes staring back from the tree line, watching, waiting, and deciding once again whether or not to let him be